guest now. I'm joined by Avi Melamed, the founder of Inside the Middle East Institute. Avi, thanks so much for being here.
Hello, Nicole.
Let's talk about the significance of the IDF Israel killing the deputy head of Hamas's military wing in Lebanon. First off, what do we know about Hamas operating in Lebanon already? And is this really a sign that the IDF is going in and doing these targeted attacks, really assassinations?
Well, Hamas is based in Lebanon. Is cooperating with the Hezbollah. We know it for a long period of time. In fact, many of the attacks that were carried out since the beginning of the war along the northern border was basically carried out by Hamas-affiliated members in Lebanon. They are mostly based in the Lebanese refugee camps, particularly in the south part of Lebanon, in the area of Tyre, in the area of Sidon, and other places. There is a strong cooperation between Hamas and Hezbollah in that sense. This person that was eliminated today by Israel is yet another person in the chain of command of Hamas operating in the south part in Lebanon. In the end of the day, the major challenge in Lebanon is not the Hamas, it's of course the Hezbollah.
So is this a sign that Israel is going to continue to ramp up specifically these targeted attacks, targeting specific people, not only Hamas, but as you said, Hezbollah is the major threat?
Yes, definitely, and this is part of this whole skirmish that we see in the last couple of weeks between Israel and Hezbollah along the Israeli-Lebanese border, when Israel and the Hezbollah are basically operating in what I call the zone between the orange line and the red line.
Before we switch gears and talk about the hostage situation, as that's also a major headline happening now with reports that a hostage deal is significantly underway, with reports that it's going to involve a ceasefire. How will a ceasefire in the south impact what we're seeing in the north right now?
Well, it's very likely that ceasefire in the south will contribute to some kind of a calmness in the northern part. Again, but we have to be very, very cautious about it, because there may be a situation where, while we'll have some sort of let's say ceasefire in the south, there will be a continuation of skirmish along the Israeli-Lebanese border. We have to be aware of that possibility. We'll have just to see how things will evolve on the ground.
Because why would we stop seeing an increase in attacks from the northern front if it's Hezbollah doing these attacks rather than Hamas?
Because we have to remember something very significant, and this is something that we talked about, Nicole, and this is the unifying the arenas. You may remember that we talked when Hezbollah and Hamas basically worked together. One of the major concepts was unifying the arenas, and the concept was that when Hamas and Islamic Jihad are going to war, Hezbollah is joined to the war full capacity. It didn't happen, and the Hezbollah contribution, sort of speaking, currently for that situation is this skirmish that we see along the Israeli-Lebanese border. There was an interesting statement by the Hezbollah who says, I'm not going to stop my contribution unless the aggression against Gaza Strip is going to be fully stopped. So it may indicate that even if there is going to be a ceasefire, a fragile ceasefire in the south, we may expect that the Hezbollah will continue those local domestic skirmish, because the Hezbollah will have an interest to say, I'm continuing my contribution to this whole struggle, because the Hezbollah is doing that because one of its major challenges that he's now facing a very substantial damage to its image, because he didn't really came whole capacity into this war as he basically was marketing to the Arab world.
And all of these talks of a ceasefire all revolve around the potential hostage deal. We heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying that there is significant progress. He's even going to be meeting with not just the war cabinet, not just the expanded cabinet, the government as well. So this is pretty significant, it sounds like, because if they are all going to meet, is it likely that they are going to approve such a hostage deal?
It seems like they are. We have to wait and see what will be the final details about it. Apparently, there is something that is really seriously brewing up, and we are all waiting to see what will be the news about it. Let's go back to what I said since day one of this war. Israel is fighting against Hamas as if there are no hostages, and Israel is dealing with the issue of releasing the hostages as if there is no war. And what we see right now, we have to remember something very significant. We talked about it, Nicole, a couple of times. For Hamas, the hostages is almost the last resort, because they are basically relying on two cards, hoping that that will save their rule in Gaza Strip, or what is left from the rule in Gaza Strip. One is the story of the hostages, and the other thing is the story of the American administration. They hope that the American administration will put put pressure on Israel to end the campaign. They hope that as long as they could stretch the story of the hostages, that will put more and more pressure on Israeli government from the Israeli families of the hostages to basically end the campaign and bring everybody back home. This is the name of the game.
Well, and this, all the reports that we're seeing, this is not the end of it, because the reports are stating that it's mainly going to be women and children. So how does this also prolong the fighting, and how does it go into soldiers, whether that be women, female, or male soldiers, and males in general that are still hostage in Gaza?
This is a very significant question, and people don't really talk about it. We have to remember, we are talking currently about civilians, particularly women and kids, but remember that we have soldiers that are in captivity in the hands of Hamas. Reminding everybody, for Hamas, holding the Israeli soldiers is a big card, because Hamas always vote to the Palestinians that he is going to release all the Palestinians that are imprisoned in Israel. We have to remember that, and we have to remember something in addition to that, which is very significant and nobody is really talking about it, but it should be on the table. We don't know how many of the hostages are alive. And I think that one of the most significant things that the Israeli government has to do, whether there is going to be right now a phase of some sort of a deal, one of the things that Israel must do is demand that the Red Cross will have all the accurate information about the well-being of the hostages that are being held by Hamas. We are looking at a long, agonizing process. We have to take it into consideration. We may have to pay more and more prices, but we have to keep our eyes on the ball. In the end of his story, in the end of this story, Hamas rule in Gaza Strip must come to an end.
I have a question, because even if the Red Cross does get this list from Hamas stating who's alive, who is dead, who is injured, how do we vet and verify that list if it's coming from a terrorist organization?
Well, that's a good question, but we have to rely on the reports of the Red Cross, because in the end of the day, this is the list, sort of speaking, that Israel will have in its possession, basically saying to Hamas, this is the information you provided through the Qatari government to the Red Cross. We are dealing with that specific information. Now, there may be a situation that not all of the hostages are in the hands of Hamas. We have to remember that. We have to take it into consideration. But I have to reiterate it time and again. We are looking at a long process, agonizing process. We need a very strong nerve to deal with our story, and reminding us all, we still have the story of the soldiers. We haven't talked about the story of the soldiers yet. And this is yet one other reason why, in the end of the day, we simply have to end Hamas rule in Gaza Strip.
And the fighting is certainly happening in Gaza right now. In fact, let's cross live to our I-24 News correspondent, Jonathan Regev, who is in southern Israel near the Gaza border right now. Jonathan, what can you tell us about the latest action that you're seeing near that Gaza border?
So what I can tell you, Nicole, is that actually we're not seeing a lot of it. And this is opposed to what has been happening here recently. We're in Sderot, which faces the northern part of Gaza City. I was here on Sunday, and the artillery was extremely loud, especially in the area of Jabalia, which is just about, maybe 2 miles to the west of us. It was very, very loud, and it's not loud at all at the moment. Is that indicative of perhaps the deal that may be progressing according to the reports? Perhaps. We don't have any information about that, but we do know that it's relatively quiet now. In the hour or so that we're here, it's been relatively quiet when it comes to rockets fired towards this direction since the morning. There have been red alert sirens, but not a lot of them, and therefore, is this an indication of something that might happen? Perhaps. We don't know, but what we do know is that we are hearing more and more reports of a possible deal. The reports coming from Jerusalem, from Washington, from Doha, at least the last hour or so has been relatively quiet here, indicative of a possible deal, perhaps.
Well, and all of that relative quiet as well happening as we're also hearing reports that the IDF is considering allowing residents who are within the 4 to 7 kilometers from the Gaza border who have evacuated to possibly return home soon. What's the sense that you're getting on the ground if it is a safe environment for them to return home to?
No, not a safe environment. And apart from that, we've heard from three different factors. One is two local councils, Sha'ar Negev and Sdot Negev, which is a little bit to the south of where I am, and the municipality of Sderot, the city where we are saying that at least for the moment it is not happening. And if anything, we've heard from Defense Minister Yoav Gallant saying a few days ago that he thinks that this is something that may happen at the beginning of 2024, which is about 6 weeks from now. So for the moment, this is not something that is happening. Not only that, we also heard reports from the municipality of Sderot and other factors that the grants given by the states for people in hotels, people who are living in this area and now have been allocated to hotels, that all these grants have been extended at least until the end of December. Therefore, at least until the end of the year, I don't expect people coming even to the communities 4 to 7 kilometers, and certainly not to those who are closer to the border.
24 News correspondent Jonathan Regev, thank you for that update from southern Israel. Now, Avi, as we're taking a look at some of the reports coming out of what this hostage deal is all, what it's all taken apart of, one of the things that it's according to the reports is that the IDF won't be able to use surveillance drones for at least a period of time during this days-long ceasefire. How could that complicate Israel's war efforts and all of the progress that they've made so far if they can't see what's happening, especially what Hamas is doing while they're not fighting?
Well, I don't know about that specific detail, but I will say something like that. To the best of my knowledge, the IDF says to the government, look, we can handle this pause of 4 or 5 days. That's not going to interrupt significantly our war plan, and we can deal with that. One more thing that is very significant to mention, and we talked about it, Nicole, in different occasions. The more the IDF is on the ground in Gaza Strip, the ability to gather information is enormously increasing. And we saw some indication for that, for example, like in the story of Shifa Hospital and other places. So it's kind of like compensate, let's put it this way, in the context of like using those drones. But in the end of the day, I think that, as I said before, we have to look at the way that Israel finally is setting the course, setting the objective, and basically saying, with everything aside, the deals about the hostages, the poses, and so on, there must be, what we say, an eye on the ball, meaning looking at the final objective, taking down Hamas rule in Gaza Strip. The Israeli Defense Forces at this point, to the best of my understanding, basically saying to the government, we are moving very well according to the military plans, even ahead of schedule. We can continue, we can deal with a pause, which also, of course, supports the government. By the way, a pause is also, in a way, kind of like good for the IDF in many ways. So in the end of the day, I would say that if we're going to have a short pause, it's not something that, to the best of my understanding, is going to significantly disrupt the Israeli war plan.
And we heard from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu about the progress, in his words, that Israel is making towards this hostage deal. Let's take a listen to what Netanyahu had to say.
We are currently focusing on a very strong and active defense in the north in order to achieve a crushing victory in the south. Our first objective, annihilating Hamas. We will not stop until it is done. Second objective, bringing the hostages back. We're making progress. I don't think we should go into details at this time, but hopefully we'll have good news soon. The third objective, to ensure that what happened in Gaza will not happen again. We want to regain security, and we will operate and restore security in the south and in the north. And the main instrument we have is the Israeli spirit that is manifested here through the soldiers and commanders coming from all parts of Israel and from all sectors of Israeli society. It's an amazing force, and I salute you and tell you, we will continue until we achieve victory.
Now, this came ahead of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also meeting with the War Cabinet, the expanded cabinet, and the government tonight at 8 to really take a look at that hostage deal. Avi, are we expecting any hiccups to come from the government meeting tonight? I know specifically we heard from National Security Minister Ben-Gvir warning about the release of Palestinian prisoners. According to reports, it might involve hundreds of Palestinian prisoners released in exchange for at least 50 Israeli hostages. Do we expect this to be controversial in tonight's meeting?
It may be controversial, but I think that in the end of the day, if it's going to be something that is seriously on the table, I think that the Israeli government decision would be to go with that deal, basically to bring at least some of the hostages back home, with all the ramifications that come along with that. Because one of the ramifications, I'm not talking about the political one, I'm talking about the emotional in terms of the public opinion, of course, is that let's assume that there is going to be a deal, and let's assume that some 50, 60, 70, I don't know the exact number of hostages are going to be released and back home, hopefully. We still have the others that are left, and that means that the other families, of course, will increase pressure on the Israeli government to move on with additional deals to bring their beloved one back homes. But I think that if there is going to be a substantial, very concrete offer, deal tonight on the table of the government, in the end of the day, in the voting, I think that the Israeli government will take it.
Certainly something we'll be continuing to look at into these coming hours. But let's turn our attention to what's happening abroad now. German authorities, they are cracking down on anti-Semitic hate speech, raiding the homes of 17 people in Bavaria accused of targeting and harassing Jews online. Now, the suspects are said to have celebrated the October 7th attack on Israel, spreading hate speech against Jewish people on social media, and even using symbols of banned terrorist organizations. Now, to break it all down, I'm joined by journalist and political analyst James Jackson, joining us from Berlin. James, let's talk a little bit about these arrest raids. What's the significance of them? Specifically, all of them have been happening in Bavaria.
Yes, so Bavaria is known as one of the strictest of Germany's federal states, 17 federal states. It's one of the biggest and it's one of the most conservative. And so in this case, the Bavarian state prosecutors' prosecution of crimes is a federal matter, as in it's a question for the states in Germany. So they've decided they're going to make a big show of strength and show that they don't tolerate anti-Semitism. They've raided 17 properties this morning, some of which were belonging to Hell's Angels, according to reports. A Turkish man who was a Turkish citizen who was a member of the Hell's Angels, for posting things such as pictures of Hitler, who said, "I could have killed all the Jews, but I left a few so that you know what they're like." So some pretty nasty stuff there across the state. We have seen an uptick in these cases of anti-Semitism and just general tension, racism across Germany. Today we have the Islam Conference, the Conference of Islam, taking place in Berlin, where the Interior Minister is discussing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and Islam with a group of experts, although very few representatives of the Muslim community. So I think one thing that's interesting about this taking place in Bavaria in particular is that as much as the Bavarian state prosecutors are making themselves out to be warriors against anti-Semitism, we actually saw something very interesting, very controversial this summer in the Bavarian election in late summer, where the deputy prime minister of Bavaria, Hubert Aiwanger, was accused by his former teacher as well as classmates of having made and been involved with anti-Semitic jokes, pamphlets, Holocaust jokes, including at or on a school trip to a concentration camp. So of course he did not suffer politically for that. In fact, his party won in influence, and he remained in his post, supported by the conservative CSU, the Christian Social Union, who are quite a mainstream party here. His party is a bit smaller and only represented in Bavaria, perhaps also Rhineland-Palatinate in the west. But they're a growing party. So it's an interesting one in Germany, seeing how anti-Semitism on the one hand and in Bavaria is taken very seriously when it's in relation to Israel, when it's coming from members of Muslim minorities, but perhaps it is taken a bit less seriously when it's taken from senior German politicians.
Well, and you also mentioned Germany's interior minister also just urging Muslim groups to explicitly condemn the October 7th attack. So we are hearing some pretty strong statements coming out of the interior minister, but are the 5.5 million Muslims in Germany, are they expected to really heed any of these warnings or these statements?
I think it's a good question. There has been criticism of this. It's not just the Interior Minister, in fact, also the federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who said all Arabs, including Germans of Arabic descent, should distance themselves from Hamas, condemn Hamas. That is a lot of people, and I think some of them would be quite offended to be put in the same bucket as this awful terrorist group, Hamas, that killed so many Jews so mercilessly. So there's been a bit of pushback, but I have to say, actually, the German politics is very much on board. All of the people I've mentioned, the Interior Minister, the President is from the Social Democrats, the ruling party of Chancellor Scholz, which is a centre-left party. Whereas I think this kind of rhetoric in other countries might be considered right-wing rhetoric, the idea that Muslims have to distance themselves from Hamas. So I think Germany is a country with a lot of Muslims, and it's actually a very diverse country, but you don't really see that represented in public life. You see, even today at the Islam Conference, there were very, very few actual Muslim community members represented there. So German politics is a bit of an insular bubble on this issue, and that could potentially lead to people feeling alienated, but it could also have some positive effects. So I'm not here to make that decision, but I think it's absolutely worth noting that you don't see many Muslims represented in German politics. I think the first minister ever from a Muslim background out of the 5 million in Germany, or more, 5 million plus, was Cem Özdemir, who's quite a conservative chap, a member of the Greens, and he only was appointed a few years ago as agricultural minister. So there's a lot to see, and I think there is a bit of tension bubbling in Germany about whether this crackdown on anti-Semitism is being fairly applied.
James Jackson, thank you for that update about what's happening abroad right now. Thanks for joining us.
Okay.
Now, as we take a look at what's happening internationally, there's also a lot of international pressure continuing to beat down here on Israel. Also, international officials really planning the next day, what's going to happen the day after in Gaza, specifically with the Palestinian Authority, which we continue to hear international pressure for the PA to possibly take over, even if it's a revitalized and reconstructed Palestinian Authority. But new reports also stating that Gulf states possibly financially assisting to rebuild the Gaza Strip and help with these efforts. So what does this all mean when it comes into the day after in Gaza?
Well, Nicole, I want to make two comments. First one is about the West and the story of Gaza Strip. Ironically speaking, while many people in the Arab and the Muslim world criticize and hold Hamas accountable for what happened in Gaza Strip, and not only from yesterday, since he took over in 2007, Western circles constantly insisted to exempt Hamas from responsibility. Western circles who exempted Hamas from accountability, they bear responsibility for doing that. They have to know that. The second thing, talking about the day after, yes, it goes back to something that I was talking about since the beginning of the war, which I called regional framework. And basically what I said is, any effectively addressing the story of Gaza Strip requires creation of what I call regional framework that brings together major players in the Middle East who has interest to basically create a new conditions on the ground in Gaza Strip. We're talking about Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and others. And they will build some kind of there will be some sort of scaffoldings that actually, based upon that, you could start applying on the ground the many issues that you need to address, because it takes an enormous financial resource in actually basically creating this new reality in Gaza Strip. So no wonder there that those major Arab states, particularly the Gulf states, should be very proactively involved in settling the situation in Gaza Strip post the war.
Certainly something we'll continue to keep an eye on. Avi Melamed, thank you so much for breaking down all of these latest developments on this 46th day of the war, everything that's happening here.